US President Joe Biden is hosting the leaders of Japan and South Korea today in a first-of-its-kind trilateral meeting at Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland. Biden is hoping to smooth over a historically icy relationship between the two neighbors in order to bolster military cooperation in the region amid rising tensions with China and North Korea. Now, the meeting between Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol marks the first time that Biden has actually used the Maryland retreat for a summit during his presidency. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said this summit comes at a moment when our region and the world are being tested by geopolitical competition, by the climate crisis, by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, by nuclear provocations. Our heightened engagement is part of our broader efforts to revitalize, to strengthen, to knit together our alliances and partnerships. US officials are confident that its two main allies in the region share Washington's view on most global issues, although a joint statement is expected to stop short of directly referring to China to reflect South Korean reservations about openly criticizing Beijing. Now, Blinken added, Japan and South Korea are core allies, not just in the region but around the world. And the summit would mark what we believe is a new era in trilateral cooperation. He said he expected a continued focus on North Korea given the endless provocations, but the meeting would address a much more expansive agenda. Japan and South Korea are some of the most strategic US allies in the Pentagon's heavily armed Indo-Pacific area of responsibility, the geographic combatant command that hosts more than half of the globe's 10 largest standing militaries. The summit comes as tensions between Beijing and Washington have intensified over China's territorial expansion in the South China Sea, aggression towards Taiwan, allegations of espionage and human rights abuses. The US ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, recently said countries in the Indo-Pacific are desperate for an increased American presence as they fear the risks of an unanchored and untethered China. Aimed at forging a trilateral alliance, the occasion marks the first summit involving the three nations outside international forums and is the first time that foreign leaders will visit the US presidential country retreat since 2015, underscoring the importance of this meeting to Washington. But the Japanese ambassador said the meeting, along with other security initiatives like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue and the US's trilateral pact with Australia and the UK known as AUKUS, symbolizes a restructuring and strengthening of America's alliances and commitments in the region. He went on to say China will never win the award for the good neighbor policy. They have a land conflict with India. They just fired water cannons at the Philippine Coast Guard. They're in constant conflict for the Senkaku Islands, the Japanese name for the chain of islands in the East China Sea that Beijing claims. The ambassador also said China's military fired 5 missiles on Japan's exclusive economic zone following a visit last year to Taiwan by the then US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. He says they've had economic coercion as recently as 2017 against South Korea and then Australia. I'm doing this by memory and I'm probably missing half of it. The summit, aimed at deterring China's growing aggression, has been greeted with relief in Washington as it attempts to present a united regional front against Chinese military activity near Taiwan and North Korea's development of more powerful weapons of mass destruction in defiance of UN-led sanctions. And needless to say, most observers believe China is not happy at all with this trilateral cooperation and will keep a hawk's eye on this summit. China's state-owned media outlet Global Times described the summit as taking steps towards a mini NATO and accusing the US of undermining the post-Cold War economic integration process in Asia. China has denounced the summit, saying it opposes relevant countries forming various cliques and their practices of exacerbating confrontation and jeopardizing other countries' strategic security. That's not all. Wang Yi, China's top diplomat, warned Japan and South Korea last month against aligning themselves too closely with the United States, saying, and I quote, "No matter how yellow you dye your hair or how sharp you make your nose, you'll never turn into a European or American. You'll never turn into a Westerner." Well, the possibility of economic retaliation by China is a serious concern for both South Korea and Japan, who count China as their largest trading partner. And here's what is equally interesting. A standalone summit bringing together Japanese and South Korean leaders would have been almost unthinkable just a year ago when the Northeast Asian neighbors were embroiled in disputes over their bitter wartime legacy. But clearly, China seems to have changed all that. Let's go back to Shri at this point. Shri, I can't get over this very interesting choice of words by the Japanese ambassador to the US. Um, and of course, the Chinese response. I mean, of course, you can see that China is anything but amused over the fact that this summit is taking place. But really, what is the significance of these three leaders getting together at Camp David and, addressing issues such as North Korea and China? How do we look at it, and also in view of the fact that Japan and South Korea have a very complex history?
Right. So that's a very good question that you asked, Neha, because in global diplomacy, often what you do is more important than what you say. As they say, actions speak louder than words. So the significance of Camp David is very simple. It's essentially where traditionally US presidents have taken global leaders when they're trying to forge something that is of great significance or something which is complicated. So, like you mentioned, since 2015, US has not hosted any global leader at Camp David. So by default, this is President Biden's first Camp David retreat with global leaders. He took over in 2021. He assumed office in 2021. So that, first of all, tells you that how important and seriously US takes this visit. Now for China, unfortunately, it wants to be the big bad boy in the Indo-Pacific area, and it essentially is telling the world that I will do pretty much what I please, but others should not do what they think is in their interest. So that obviously is not going to be acceptable to other countries. China was very happy when Korea and Japan had a less than comfortable relationship because of the historic occupation by Japan of South Korea between 1910 and 1945. But much credit to President Yoon of Korea for taking South Korea closer to Japan and coming into this relationship. And also credit to President Biden, because if you remember, President Yoon had actually visited US previously in April, where he even sang American Pie in the White House, Neha. So now this is becoming very, very uncomfortable for Beijing, which sees that suddenly two countries that were traditionally enemies have been brought together very close by President Biden. Now we know that US is going to go into election next year, and we don't know if President Biden will be there. And then in Japan also, it's possible that you may have a snap election anytime. The only person who's going to remain in power till 2027 is President Yoon. So, but I think what this meeting is going to do is forge some sort of an alliance and understanding which commits each of these countries to closer cooperation and some sort of alliance which enhances security in that region and also brings them closer in terms of cooperation technologically and economically. So that is what I think President Biden and the two other leaders, Kishida and Yoon, are trying to achieve at this summit, Neha. And it's easy to understand why Beijing is furious that this is being held at this point. For Beijing, this is an unnecessary provocation. But unfortunately, the world doesn't work as per Beijing's point of view.
No matter how yellow you dye your hair, I can't get over it. And Sri, I think it has to be admitted that, China deserves to be singularly credited for bringing a lot of countries together and closer, regardless of their history. But moving
Absolutely.
on.
Yeah. So the
Sorry,
point,
go
I just
ahead,
want to
go
make
ahead.
one quick point here,
Yes.
before we move on, which is that, China seems to be demanding global respect. I mean, if you look at countries like US, they earn respect by the way they conduct their policy, the foreign policy, and the aid that they offer. But in China's case, it seems to be telling the world that now I am the second largest economy in the world. I have this economic heft. So therefore, you must bow down to me. Therefore, you must respect. But unfortunately, that's not how the world works. And that's something China has to recognize and then fall in line and work in harmony with other countries. So till that happens, I don't think China will get the respect that it is demanding right now.
China should work in harmony with the rest of the world. I think you ask for too much, Sri.